The knock on Halloween night that changed everything. I know this is going to sound crazy, but I have to share what happened to me last Halloween. I live in an old apartment building, and Halloween has always been a weird time for me. Growing up, I was the kid who avoided the spooky decorations and stayed in while my friends went out trick-or-treating. Maybe that's why I ended up spending Halloween alone in my apartment last year, surrounded by dim lights, a bowl of candy I bought on sale, and a stack of horror movies waiting for me to hit play. My apartment is one of those vintage places that creaks with every little movement, and I swear the walls have stories to tell. The kind of place that might have a ghost or two lingering around, especially with how quiet it gets at night. I always feel like I'm being watched, especially when I hear the wind howling outside, making the windows rattle. Maybe I've watched too many horror movies, but the atmosphere was thick with something I couldn't quite put my finger on that night. As I settled onto my couch, wrapped in a blanket and clutching a handful of candy corn, I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in my stomach. The eerie music from the movie filled the room and I tried to lose myself in the story. Just when the tension peaked, I heard it, a soft, persistent knock on my door. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. I paused the movie, listening intently. There it was again, a faint knock that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My heart raced. Who could it be at this hour? It was well past the time when kids would be out trick-or-treating, and honestly, I wasn't sure if I even wanted to answer the door. I got up and walked slowly toward the door, trying to steady my breathing. I peeked through the peephole, but all I could see was the dimly lit hallway outside. No one was there. I hesitated, torn between curiosity and caution. I know it sounds silly, but the last time I opened the door on Halloween night, years ago, I had a strange experience that still haunts me. When I was a kid, something bizarre happened on Halloween. I was about 10 years old, and I remember feeling invincible in my pirate costume, sword at my side and a plastic skull and crossbones hanging from my neck. My friends and I were buzzing with excitement as we roamed the neighborhood, filling our bags with candy. But it wasn't the candy that terrified me that night, it was the knock. After a long evening of trick-or-treating, I returned home with a pillowcase full of sweets. I was on a sugar high, my parents letting me stay up late to count my haul. But as we sat there in the living room, there was a sudden knock on the front door. My mom went to answer it, and I remember feeling a chill run down my spine. Standing there on our porch was a man dressed as a classic ghost, white sheet and all. But his eyes, oh God, his eyes. They were dark and hollow, like he was staring through me rather than at me. I couldn't see his face, but something about the way he held his arms, outstretched, almost pleading, made my heart pound. "Trick or treat," he said in a raspy voice, but it wasn't like the cheerful chants from the other kids. There was a heaviness to his tone that made my skin crawl. I was terrified, frozen in place while my mom rummaged for candy. Just as she handed him a handful of sweets, the power went out, plunging us into darkness. I heard the ghostly figure take a step back, and that was when I felt the urge to run. I bolted up the stairs, not daring to look back. I could hear my mom calling my name, but I didn't stop until I reached my room, locking the door behind me. After that night, I never forgot the ghostly figure and that eerie knock. I know it sounds irrational, but I never wanted to experience anything like it again. Now, standing in front of my apartment door with that memory flooding back, I shook my head. "Get a grip, Jack," I muttered to myself. I reminded myself that it was probably just a prank or maybe a neighbor who forgot their key. But still, the knocking continued, soft yet insistent. I felt the dread creeping back in. I backed away from the door, my heart racing. Should I call someone? Maybe the landlord? But who calls their landlord on Halloween night? I took a deep breath and steeled my resolve. I was not about to let some random knock ruin my Halloween. As I turned to head back to the couch, I heard it again, a single, sharp knock. This time it felt different, almost deliberate. I stood frozen for a moment before finally deciding to open the door just a crack. Just enough to peek outside. With shaky hands, I turned the knob and pulled the door open slightly, peering into the hallway. Nothing. Just the empty corridor lit by flickering lights. But before I could close the door, I noticed something on the floor. A small envelope, slightly crumpled and clearly out of place. My pulse quickened again and I reached down to pick it up. The envelope was white, unmarked, and strangely pristine against the dusty floor. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone lurking nearby, but the hallway was empty. I tore it open and pulled out a single piece of paper. My hands trembled as I unfolded it, revealing a message written in jagged, shaky handwriting. "You should have stayed inside." A chill ran down my spine. I glanced back down the hallway, half expecting to see that ghostly figure again. Was someone playing a prank on me? I couldn't shake the feeling that this was something more, something sinister. The last time I had opened my door on Halloween, it had led to a night I could never forget. I slammed the door shut, heart racing. I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath, the message echoing in my mind. I was alone in a dark apartment with my childhood fears creeping back in. The weight of the envelope in my hands felt heavier than ever. Taking a moment to collect myself, I decided to turn off the movie. It no longer felt appropriate. I sank back onto the couch, clutching the paper tightly. The familiar sound of the wind outside grew louder, rattling the windows as if echoing my fears. Was it a prank or was there something more? As I sat there in the dark, I knew I couldn't ignore this. I needed to find out who had left the message and why they had targeted me. The only thing I could do was wait until morning and figure out my next steps. But deep down I could feel it, the sense that this Halloween was just beginning. Darlene's heart raced as the boy lunged toward her. In that moment, time slowed, and a surge of adrenaline coursed through her veins. She didn't know how long she stood frozen in shock, but the instinct to survive kicked in hard. Her eyes flew open just as the blade glinted in the dim light of her foyer. With a primal scream, she instinctively turned to run. Her mind scrambled, searching for an escape route as she darted away from the oncoming threat. She reached the living room and threw herself against the heavy wooden coffee table, knocking over a lamp in her frantic attempt to create a barrier between her and the ghostly figure. Darlene's heart pounded like a drum in her ears, drowning out all other sounds. The boy's footsteps were muffled against the carpet, but she could still feel the weight of his presence closing in. She quickly glanced over her shoulder, just in time to see the blue pumpkin roll across the floor, leaving a faint trail of something dark and menacing behind it. The sight sent another jolt of fear through her. "Stay back," she shouted, her voice trembling as she grabbed a chair and held it in front of her like a shield. The boy paused, just for a moment, tilting his head to one side as if contemplating her resolve. Why are you doing this?" Darlene managed to stammer, her throat dry with fear. He said nothing. Instead, he took a slow step forward, the knife still in hand, its blade gleaming ominously. In the dim light, Darlene noticed something odd about his eyes. There was an emptiness to them, a void that chilled her to the bone. They weren't just dark, they were soulless. With a surge of desperation, Darlene lunged towards the kitchen, hoping to find anything that could be used as a weapon. She remembered the heavy cast-iron skillet hanging on the wall and dashed toward it, praying she could reach it before he reached her. Just as her fingers grasped the cold handle, she felt a rush of wind behind her. Panic surged within her as she swung around, skillet raised, ready to strike. The boy was closer now, so close she could see the bloodstains on his clothes, the way they seeped through the fabric and dripped onto the floor. "Stay back," Darlene yelled again, and this time her voice held a shaky determination. "I will hurt you." The boy seemed unfazed by her threat. Instead, he raised the knife, pointing it directly at her, his face still devoid of emotion. It was as if he were a puppet, acting out a part in a play without any understanding of what was at stake. "Trick or treat," he finally spoke, his voice low and eerie, echoing with a hollow resonance. A chill ran down Darlene's spine. This was no longer a game and she was no longer playing. She swung the skillet down towards him, but he dodged to the side with an agility that caught her off guard. Darlene's breath quickened. She needed to think quickly. She glanced towards the back door, hoping to make it outside. It was her only chance, but the boy was blocking the way now, a twisted grin spreading across his face. "Wrong answer," he repeated, mocking her. "You should have stayed inside." Darlene felt the walls closing in around her. She had to get out. With a burst of courage, she sprinted towards the kitchen, the boy close behind her, his laughter ringing in her ears like a twisted melody. She flung open the back door and dashed outside into the cool night air. The moon hung low in the sky, illuminating her path as she ran into the yard. She could hear the boy's footsteps pounding behind her, growing louder and louder. She didn't look back, she just ran. "Help! Someone help me!" she screamed, hoping someone in the neighborhood would hear her. But the streets were empty, the laughter and joy of earlier in the night had vanished. All that remained was silence, punctuated only by her heavy breathing and the boy's relentless pursuit. Darlene made a hard turn and darted into the alleyway next to her house, praying it would lead her to safety. Her heart raced as she sprinted down the narrow path, her mind racing with thoughts of escape. Would she find help? Would she make it back to safety? As she navigated through the alley, she spotted an old shed at the far end, partially obscured by overgrown weeds. It might be a hiding spot, she thought, or even a place to find something useful. She ran towards it, heart pounding, praying the boy wouldn't catch up to her. She reached the shed and yanked the door open. The creaking hinges sounded like a warning bell, but she had no time to think. Darlene slipped inside, pulling the door shut behind her and leaning against it to catch her breath. Inside, the shed was dark, filled with the scent of damp wood and rusted tools. It was a cramped space, cluttered with old gardening equipment and forgotten treasures. Her eyes darted around, searching for something she could use. A rusty shovel caught her eye, a potential weapon. She grabbed it, clutching it tightly as she listened intently for any sign of the boy. The minutes felt like hours as she stood in the darkness, heart pounding. Suddenly, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching, the crunch of leaves underfoot echoing in the stillness. "Where are you, Darlene?" the boy called out, his voice eerily calm. "You can't hide forever." Darlene held her breath, her heart racing in her chest. She could see the faint light from outside seeping through the cracks in the shed, and her mind raced with thoughts of how to escape. Just then she spotted a window at the back of the shed, partially boarded up. It was small, but she might be able to squeeze through. She made her way to it, hoping to escape unnoticed. As she reached the window, she heard the boy's voice grow closer. "You shouldn't have opened the door, Darlene. You should have just let me go." She climbed up onto an old wooden crate, her heart racing as she pulled back the boards and peered outside. The moonlight spilled in, illuminating the space around her. She took a deep breath, summoning all her courage. In a moment of panic, she pushed the boards aside and squeezed her body through the opening. The sharp edges of the wood scraped against her skin, but she didn't care. She had to get out. With one final push, she fell onto the ground outside, landing awkwardly on the grass. Darlene quickly scrambled to her feet and glanced around, searching for a place to run. The night was eerily quiet, and she could see shadows moving in the distance. But then she heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind her, the boy's laughter echoing in the still air. "I can see you, Darlene," he called out, taunting her. In a blind panic, she took off running again, her feet pounding against the ground as she raced down the street. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to put as much distance between herself and the boy as possible. "Help! Someone please help me," she cried out, her voice hoarse from fear. But the streets remained empty, no lights on in the houses, no sign of life anywhere. It was as if the whole neighborhood had vanished. As she turned a corner, she spotted a flickering light in the distance, her neighbor's house. Maybe they were home, maybe they could help her. Darlene sprinted toward it, praying with every step that she would find safety. But just as she reached the porch, she heard the boy's voice again, chilling her to the bone. "You can't escape me, Darlene. You opened the door." Darlene turned to face him, adrenaline fueling her. She raised the shovel, ready to defend herself. "Get away from me," she shouted, her voice fierce. The boy stopped in his tracks, staring at her with an expression that was equal parts amusement and malice. "You think that will help you?" he taunted, his knife glinting in the dim light. Darlene's heart sank, but she refused to back down. "I'll use this if I have to," she warned, her grip tightening on the handle. "Wrong answer," he said, his voice low and chilling. Just then, the front door of the neighbor's house swung open, and a figure stepped out, bathed in the warm light spilling from inside. It was Mr. Thompson, an older gentleman who lived alone. He squinted at the scene unfolding before him, confusion etched on his face. "Darlene? What's going on?" he asked, glancing between her and the boy. "Help me!" Darlene cried out, relief washing over her. "He's trying to hurt me." Mr. Thompson's eyes widened as he took in the sight of the boy with the knife. "Get inside, Darlene," he shouted, stepping forward. But before Darlene could move, the boy lunged towards her with a speed that took her by surprise. She swung the shovel, hoping to land a blow, but he dodged it easily, his laughter ringing in the air like a death knell. "Let her go," Mr. Thompson shouted, stepping closer, ready to intervene. "Stay out of this, old man," the boy snapped, his voice now filled with rage. In that moment, Darlene seized her chance. She lunged forward, using all her strength to swing the shovel at the boy. This time it connected, knocking him off balance. He stumbled back, a look of shock crossing his face. "Get inside," Darlene yelled at Mr. Thompson, and he rushed toward her, taking her hand and pulling her inside the house. The boy recovered quickly, but the door slammed shut just in time, locking him outside. Darlene leaned against the door, her heart racing, panic flooding her veins. "What just happened?" Mr. Thompson asked, breathless. "Are you okay?" I think so," Darlene stammered, her voice shaky. "He just showed up. I thought he was just a kid trick-or-treating, but then, he was different." Mr. Thompson nodded, his expression serious. "We need to call the police." Get away from the door. Darlene felt a wave of relief wash over her as she stepped away, and Mr. Thompson rushed to the phone. She glanced out the window, heart in her throat, as she caught a glimpse of the boy standing on the porch, his expression dark and menacing. But now he was trapped outside. They were safe inside the warm glow of the house, and the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. As Mr. Thompson spoke to the dispatcher, Darlene sank into a nearby chair, her hands trembling. What was that? Who was he? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Thompson turned to her, concern etched on his face. I don't know, but we'll find out. Just hang tight. Darlene felt a chill run down her spine as she realized they weren't just dealing with a troubled kid. This was something far more sinister. The blue pumpkin that had been dropped outside now seemed like a sinister omen, a warning of the darkness that had invaded her life. As the minutes ticked by, they both kept glancing toward the door, listening for any sign of the boy's return. But it was quiet now, eerily so. Suddenly, the sound of sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Relief washed over Darlene as she realized help was on the way. Thank goodness, she muttered, rubbing her arms to ward off the chill. But just as she began to feel safe, the power in the house flickered and went out. Darkness engulfed them, the only light coming from the street lamps outside. Stay close, Mr. Thompson instructed, and Darlene nodded, fear gripping her heart once more. What if he comes back? She whispered, anxiety tightening her throat. He won't get in, Mr. Thompson assured her, but his voice carried an edge of uncertainty. Suddenly there was a loud banging at the door. Darlene's heart raced as she jumped to her feet, gripping the edge of the table for support. Darlene? The boy's voice rang out, echoing in the dark. Let me in. I just want some candy. Stay away from us. Darlene shouted, her voice shaking. The banging continued, growing more insistent, punctuated by the boy's chilling laughter. You shouldn't have opened the door. You shouldn't have let me in. The weight of his words hung in the air, and Darlene's breath caught in her throat. This was not just a trick-or-treater. This was a predator, and they were trapped. Help is coming, Mr. Thompson whispered, but the sound of the boy's voice echoed through the darkness, filling the room with dread. As the sirens grew louder, the banging stopped abruptly, plunging them into an unsettling silence. Darlene's heart raced as she strained to hear any movement outside. Then just as suddenly the boy's voice returned, but it was no longer playful. It was filled with rage. You can't hide forever, Darlene. I'll always find you. The door rattled violently as if he were trying to force his way inside. Darlene's mind raced. What had she done to bring this upon herself? She wished she had stayed inside, ignored the knock, or simply not opened the door. Stay back, she yelled, gripping the table with white knuckles. The sirens finally arrived, their blaring sirens slicing through the night, accompanied by flashing lights. Relief washed over her, but dread lingered in the air. Open up. Police, a voice shouted from outside. Thank God, Darlene breathed, feeling a surge of hope. Mr. Thompson rushed to the door, flinging it open to reveal a group of officers, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Where is he? One of the officers asked, scanning the area. He was just here. Darlene exclaimed, fear evident in her voice. He was trying to get in? The officers exchanged glances, and one of them motioned for the others to spread out and search the area. Darlene felt a flicker of hope but also fear. Where had the boy gone? Stay inside, the officer instructed firmly as they moved cautiously around the yard. Darlene's heart raced as she watched them move with purpose, illuminating the night with their flashlights. Did you see what he looked like? Another officer asked. Darlene nodded, recalling his pale skin, dark eyes, and the eerie blue pumpkin. He was wearing a ghost costume, but it was so strange. He didn't act like a normal kid. Just as she spoke, one of the officers shouted from the yard, "Over here." Darlene's heart sank as she rushed to the door, peering outside. The officer was standing near the blue pumpkin, now lying abandoned on the grass, smeared with dark stains. The officer turned to her, his expression grim. "This isn't candy, is it?" Darlene's stomach twisted as she looked at the pumpkin, realization dawning on her. No. No, it can't be, she stammered, the implications crashing down on her. "We need to call for backup," the officer said, his voice serious. "We might be dealing with something more than just a kid playing tricks." Darlene's heart sank further. "What do you mean?" "There have been reports of missing children around this area," the officer explained, urgency creeping into his tone. "We need to figure out what's really going on." As the officers began to investigate further, Darlene felt a sense of dread settle over her. The night had taken a dark turn, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they were in over their heads. Hours passed as they searched the area, but the boy was nowhere to be found. Eventually the officers gathered back at her front porch, their expressions serious. "We need to take your statement," one of them said, and Darlene nodded, her voice trembling as she recounted the events of the night. As she spoke, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. This was no ordinary Halloween, it had become a nightmare. The blue pumpkin, the boy in the ghost costume, and the blood, all of it swirled together in a terrifying tapestry of fear. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to break on the horizon, the officers finished their investigation. They assured Darlene they would continue to search for the boy and promised to keep her informed. "Please be careful," Darlene pleaded as they prepared to leave. "He might come back." The officer nodded, his expression grave. "We'll do everything we can to keep you safe. But for now, try to stay inside and keep your doors locked." As the officers drove away, Darlene stood on her porch, feeling the weight of the night settle around her. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but the fear still coursed through her veins. "Maybe I should have just ignored the knock," she thought, shaking her head. "Maybe then none of this would have happened." But deep down she knew it was more than just a knock. It was a warning, a sign that something was terribly wrong. And she had opened the door to darkness, something she couldn't fully understand. As she closed the door, she glanced one last time at the blue pumpkin, now a haunting reminder of the terror she had faced. She knew she wouldn't forget this Halloween, nor would she ever look at trick-or-treaters the same way again. Weeks passed, and Darlene tried to return to normalcy. She had barricaded her doors and kept the lights on every night, still shaken by the encounter. The neighborhood was quiet, but the memories lingered like ghosts in the back of her mind. One evening she decided to take a walk, needing to escape the confines of her home. As she strolled through the neighborhood, she noticed the decorations left over from Halloween, jack-o'-lanterns, cobwebs, and ghostly figures. They seemed innocuous enough, but her heart raced every time she passed a blue pumpkin. As she turned a corner, she stopped short, her breath catching in her throat. There, standing at the end of the street, was a figure in a ghost costume just like the boy's. The same blue pumpkin dangled at his side, its surface glinting in the fading light. Darlene's heart raced as she took a step back, fear gripping her. She turned to run, but as she glanced back, the figure was gone, swallowed by the darkness. That night, she locked her doors tightly, feeling a sense of unease settle in her bones. No matter how far she tried to run from the encounter, the ghost boy haunted her thoughts. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, lurking, waiting for the right moment to return. The echoes of his laughter danced in her mind, intertwining with her memories of Halloween. No longer would she think of it as a night of fun and candy, it had become a reminder of the darkness that had invaded her life, leaving her forever changed. And as the clock struck midnight, she heard a soft tap-tap at her window. As they raced through the forest, the world blurred into a cacophony of scents and sounds. Petter could feel the rush of the wind against his face, a wild thrill that ignited every nerve in his body. With each pounding step, he felt his body transform further. Muscles rippled and shifted beneath his skin, his senses heightened beyond anything he had ever known. He could smell the damp earth, the tang of pine, and the intoxicating aroma of life pulsating in the underbrush. Vlad moved like a shadow beside him, graceful and fluid, his form melding with the night. "Feel it, Petter," he urged, his voice a low murmur that seemed to resonate within Petter's very bones. "Feel the power coursing through you. Let it guide you. You are no longer just a man, you are a creature of the night, destined to embrace this existence." They weaved through the ancient trees, their limbs gnarled and twisted like the stories of old. Petter's heart raced as he became aware of the forest's rhythm, the heartbeat of nature aligning with his own. He caught a flicker of movement, a deer, darting through the underbrush. In that instant, instinct took over. He lunged forward, muscles coiling and releasing with primal grace. The chase was exhilarating, a dance of predator and prey that sparked a feral joy deep within him. Vlad's laughter echoed in the night as Petter pursued the deer. "Let your hunger guide you. You are a hunter now." The deer, sensing danger, dashed through the undergrowth, but Petter was relentless. He could feel the pulse of its heartbeat, hear the rapid thumping of its hooves against the ground. Each stride brought him closer, and as he leaped over a fallen log, he felt an intoxicating surge of energy. The forest opened up around him, moonlight spilling onto the scene, illuminating the hunt. With a final burst of speed, he lunged, his claws outstretched. The impact was swift and decisive. The deer fell beneath him, a tremor of life extinguished in an instant. Petter stood over it, panting, the thrill of the kill coursing through him like wildfire. "Embrace it," Vlad called out, his voice carrying a seductive edge. "Taste it?" Petter lowered his head, the sweet, rich scent of blood filling his senses. He hesitated for a heartbeat, memories of Navina and their children flashing through his mind. But that was the past. This was his present, his new life. He sank his teeth into the soft flesh, the warmth spreading through him like molten gold. Euphoria washed over him, and with each drop of blood, he felt the bond with Vlad tighten, their connection solidifying into something deeper and more profound. In that moment, as he fed, he understood the power that came with this existence. It was intoxicating, liberating. He was no longer just Petter, the simple woodcutter burdened by the mundane worries of family life. He was a creature of the night, a predator born from shadows, and he reveled in it. As he finished, he stepped back, feeling alive and renewed. The moon shone down, casting silver light across his fur, illuminating the wildness in his eyes. Vlad approached, a predatory smile gracing his lips. "You see, my child, this is merely the beginning. You are destined for greatness, and together we will unleash chaos upon those who would dare to challenge us." Petter straightened, the thrill of the hunt still tingling in his veins. "What now? What do you wish of me?" "There are those who seek to hunt us, to hunt our kind," Vlad said, his voice low and serious. "We must ensure that our existence remains shrouded in mystery. There are powerful clans in the shadows, and they will come for us. It is our duty to protect our realm and eliminate any threats." Petter nodded, the weight of responsibility settling upon his shoulders. "Then let us hunt them." Vlad's eyes gleamed with approval. "Yes, my wolf. We will teach them the meaning of fear. But first, you must learn to harness your powers to control the beast within." Under the full moon they trained, practicing movements and honing their instincts. Vlad taught Petter to embrace his newfound strength, how to channel it into speed and agility. They became one with the forest, blending into the shadows, moving like whispers on the wind. The night was their sanctuary, and every encounter deepened their bond, turning the thrill of the hunt into a ritual that solidified their relationship. As days turned to weeks, Petter's confidence grew. He reveled in the power that surged within him, in the freedom that came with embracing his identity. Yet, with every hunt, he felt a lingering tug of guilt for his family left behind. Though he would often dream of Navina and the children, the haunting memories dulled against the vibrancy of his new life. But Vlad was ever present, a constant reminder of what he had chosen. "You are free now, Petter. Don't let the past shackle you. Your family will remain as a fleeting thought in the back of your mind, a shadow of your former life. You must forge your new path." One night, after a successful hunt, they returned to the summit where their bond was forged. The moon hung low and full in the sky, bathing the land in silver light. Petter stood, looking out over the vast expanse of the forest, a feeling of longing creeping in. "What if I want to see them again? What if I want to tell them I'm alive?" Vlad's expression turned serious. "You may visit, but the wolf cannot live in two worlds. If you do, the beast will come for you and you will lose everything. This life is consuming and it will demand loyalty." The conflict stirred within Petter, a deep-rooted longing for the warmth of his family colliding with the intoxicating thrill of the night. "What if I could bring them with me? What if they could join us?" Vlad's laughter echoed, but it was cold, a chilling reminder of the stark reality. "Your family would not survive in this world. They would be prey. You must choose, Petter. This is not a life of safety and love, it is one of power and survival." And so, Petter faced a choice, between the life he once had and the one he was forging in the shadows. Each night blurred into the next, a whirlwind of adrenaline and blood, and yet the weight of his decision pressed heavily on his heart. One evening, after a particularly thrilling chase, Petter turned to Vlad. "Teach me more. I want to learn everything, about you, about us. I want to understand this new existence fully." Vlad smiled, a dark glimmer in his eyes. "Then you shall learn. But know this, with knowledge comes responsibility. You must learn to control your thirst, your instincts, or you risk losing yourself entirely." Under the watchful gaze of the moon, Vlad began to teach Petter the ancient ways of their kind. He spoke of the history of the vampires, the power struggles that had shaped their existence, and the delicate balance they maintained with the world. Petter absorbed every word, feeling the threads of destiny intertwine with his own. Days turned into weeks and the lessons grew in complexity. Vlad introduced Petter to other creatures of the night, werewolves, spirits, and even other vampires. Each encounter deepened his understanding and drew him further into the web of power that enveloped their realm. Yet, with each new lesson, the memories of his family lingered like a ghost. Petter often gazed at the distant horizon, where the outline of his village lay hidden beneath the trees, the hearth's warm glow beckoning him back. He longed to hold his children, to feel Navina's embrace, but the allure of the night was potent, pulling him deeper into a world where he had become a legend, a dragon and a wolf. The first challenge came sooner than expected. A rival clan, smelling weakness, sought to assert their dominance over Vlad's territory. They attacked in the dead of night, a cacophony of snarls and shrieks echoing through the forest. Petter felt the surge of adrenaline as he stood beside Vlad, ready to defend their home. "Remember what I taught you," Vlad urged, his eyes fierce with determination. "Control your beast and channel your instincts into power. We fight together." The battle was brutal, a swirling mass of fur, fangs and blood. Petter felt the wolf inside him roar to life, the primal instincts coursing through him as he charged into the fray. Claws flashed and teeth sank into flesh, the thrill of combat igniting his senses. Together he and Vlad fought as one, a symphony of power and grace, their bond solidified in the chaos. They moved in tandem, protecting one another as they pushed back against their enemies. The scent of blood filled the air, a heady reminder of their dominance. After hours of fighting, the rival clan retreated, vanquished and humiliated. Petter stood, panting and covered in blood, the exhilaration of victory coursing through him. He turned to Vlad, who stood at his side, a proud smile gracing his lips. "You have proven yourself tonight. You fought like a true wolf." But beneath the exhilaration lay a deep-seated ache. Petter knew this victory came at a cost. The shadows were filled with danger, and there would always be another challenge waiting in the dark. As the moon set, casting a soft glow over the forest, Petter felt the weight of his choices settle upon him. He had embraced the darkness, but at what cost? The thrill of power clashed with the memories of the life he once knew, and he found himself standing at a crossroads once again. With each passing night he became more entwined with Vlad, his desires pulling him further from the warmth of home. But the memories of Navina and their children haunted him like a specter, and Petter was torn between the intoxicating allure of his new existence and the remnants of the love he had left behind. In the heart of the forest, surrounded by the echoes of the night, Petter made a choice. He would embrace his power and fight for those he loved, but he would also seek a way to keep the bond with his family alive. He would find a balance, a way to honor his past while forging a new path, one that blended the darkness with the light. And so, under the watchful gaze of the stars, Petter began to weave a new legend, a tale of love and power, of sacrifice and rebirth. He would be both the dragon and the wolf, a guardian of the night who sought to protect his family, even as he danced with shadows. The journey ahead would be fraught with challenges, but Petter was ready to face them, armed with the strength of the night and the love that would forever guide him home. The Disappearances of Occoquan, Virginia. I am Detective Samara Holt, and what you are about to read is everything I remember from the strangest case I've ever worked. The Disappearances of Occoquan, Virginia. Being a detective, I've always found an interest in true crime. Disappearances, murder mysteries, cold cases, all of it activates that part of my brain that desperately seeks out answers. But if there's one case that's always piqued my interest the most, it's the case of Occoquan, Virginia. By all accounts, Occoquan was a normal little region. Not much happened there in terms of crime, and its main drawing point was the large Occoquan River that ran through the area. For years, Occoquan was a popular and peaceful place to live as houses were built on the riverfront and overviewed the gorgeous, lively water and lush forests. But that peacefulness and normality couldn't last forever. The Crane family built their own mansion on the waterfront and owned acres of land in the 60s. They lived in their Victorian-style mansion for about 5 solid years, until their youngest daughter, Amy, went missing. She was last seen swimming in the river with her sister near the dock. The account from her sister, Carla, was that Amy was in the water and having fun, then she looked at the dock and her smile faded. Carla blinked, and Amy seemingly ceased to exist in that very moment. The Crane children, Carla and her 2 older brothers Jeremy and Hector, were said to have gone mad the year following Amy's sudden disappearance, so much so that Jonathan and Elizabeth Crane were forced to seclude their children from the outside world. Eyewitness accounts attest to seeing Carla run into the nearby woods in 1967 only to never return to the Crane household. 2 years later, Elizabeth Crane died of mysterious causes and Jonathan Crane lived alone until 1971. In the wake of his death, there have been no signs of Jeremy or Hector Crane. Seemingly just gone as if they never even existed. For years, the Crane household stood over the edge of the Occoquan River, and that household is seemingly the harbinger of the region's strange activity. My first job as detective was in '97, hired by the mother of Hugo Barnes. I even remember the strangeness of my first assigned job being a missing child report. Shouldn't that have gone to someone with more experience? But I still took the job with grace and speed. I was hopeful about the case and hauled my ass down to Hugo's mother, Janice. As soon as I drove into Occoquan though, I realized why I was dumped with this assignment. The city was filled to the brim with missing child posters. It was simply another job from this place the others didn't want to take up. It was practically a ghost town. There were buildings, businesses, and houses, but rarely ever a soul in sight. I drove down the road to Janice Barnes' house, a practically deserted street that looked straight out of some horror film. The sky was a deep navy blue with the sun setting behind the trees in the distance, dense forests enveloping both sides of the route, and a single half-working streetlight down the road illuminating the low-hanging fog with a flickering bluish fluorescent light. The streetlight was covered in varying posters all pleading for help in finding some poor parent's child. I swerved into Janice's driveway and hopped out of my vehicle. The air was dense with the smell of damp leaves, and as still and quiet as a predator waiting to ambush. I knocked on Janice's door and you could hear it echo for miles. As I waited for her to answer, I observed the surrounding area. But one particular thing was hard not to notice. Up on the hillside, towering over everything else and seemingly illuminated by the now rising moon, overlooked the Crane Mansion. Its twisted and oblique, curving and jagged shapes pierced through the moonlight. Even then I could feel just how evil that house was, its presence looming and oppressive. Not long after my knock, Janice creaked open her door and invited me in. She was a frail, middle-aged woman with the voice of a chain smoker. "Just in here," she croaked as she guided me to Hugo's room. "I need you to explain this to me." Inside his bedroom, she shivered in her robe and hair curlers. He screamed. God, he screamed for me. But when I ran in here, she then shoved Hugo's bed away from the wall, and beneath it were claw marks dug into the hardwood floor. Starting from the foot of the bed, and ending at the corner of the wall. Gone, just gone. "Where'd he go?" she cried out as a tear rolled down her powdered cheek. The case of Hugo Barnes was the first sign for me to investigate further in Occoquan. How can a child just disappear into nothingness from the safety of his own home like that? Luckily, my superiors felt the same and left me with all the missing child reports of Occoquan, Virginia. Case after case, I'd speak to mothers and or fathers who recounted their children seemingly vanishing into thin air without a trace. Marnie Hughes was the next major case I took. Her family moved to Occoquan in '98 just down the street from the Crane Mansion. Marnie was just a normal 15-year-old girl. She loved her family, she had plenty of friends at her relatively small school and did well in her classes. But out of nowhere she developed some form of epilepsy halfway through her first semester. She began to suffer from what her doctors described as unpredictable full-body seizures that they blamed for the sudden onset of unusual schizophrenia. Marnie would suddenly fall into bouts of spasms and afterwards claimed that the thing in the walls was trying to ferry her away. She was seen by doctors who prescribed her antipsychotics for her hallucinations. Marnie suffered for weeks, and her parents mentally degraded along with her. CPS and the police were called to a horrifying scene on November 2, 1998. When entering the house, they found Marnie's parents trying to cook her alive in the oven, claiming that the devil wanted their daughter, so they tried to send her to God before the devil could take her. Needless to say, they were arrested on account of attempted first-degree murder and Marnie was admitted into an institution for mentally troubled children. This institution is where I come into play, as only a week after her admittance she escaped into the Occoquan woods. We spent weeks searching for her out in those woods but we never found her. She was another child who vanished into thin air. The events of that case will haunt me for as long as they rot inside my mind. The first thing I feel I need to speak on was the tape. A recording of Marnie's first and only therapy session at the institution. I'll do my best to transcribe what was said. Dr. Burks, so where do we feel comfortable beginning? Marnie, here, when I moved here. Dr. Burks, what about here? Was the move stressful? I can only imagine that it was. Marnie, yeah, but that wasn't the problem. Dr. Burks, so what is Marnie? Was it kids at school or your pardash? Marnie, it is the problem. Dr. Burks. Marnie, God, you can't see it either. I'm fucking going crazy here. It's been here the whole time. Dr. Burks, Marnie, you've got to work with me here or else we'll never get anywhere. Are you seeing things again? Like hallucinations? Marnie, you can call it a hallucination. You can call it whatever you want like my other doctors. But that's not going to stop the fact that it's in here. With us. Dr. Burks, you need to be taking your meds, Marnie. They are supposed to help with your symptoms. Marnie, you are not listening to me. At this point in the tape, Marnie is audibly frustrated. She's sobbing into her hands as if totally defeated. Her psychiatrist clicks her pen and lets out a sigh. Dr. Burks, okay. Let's discuss this then. If you're taking your medication and this isn't a hallucination, reason with me. Talking through it will help us both understand what you're dealing with. I truly do want to help you, Marnie. I'm sincerely sorry for not believing you. Tell me everything. Marnie. I saw it. I saw it a few days after we moved in. In the woods, by the river. Dr. Burks, it's okay to cry, Marnie. No need to stop yourself. Marnie, I didn't pay it much mind. I thought it was one of the neighbors from the mansion. But I learned no one lived there, and I still kept seeing it for weeks. It watched me from the woods. And then it called my name. Dr. Burks. The Crane Mansion, right? Marnie, it knew my name. I couldn't sleep. It was always watching, always. I could feel it peer in through my window. It never just observed, it wanted, it desired. Dr. Burks, don't take me wrong, but I feel as though what you're experiencing is a manifestation of your fear. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that what you're experiencing isn't real or isn't tangible. But I'm saying that if we can address and figure out this fear, whatever you're seeing may leave you alone. Marnie. Dr. Celine Burks, maiden name Tillman. Dr. Burks. How do you know that? Marnie, you went to George Mason University and you lived in Virginia your whole life. You moved to Occoquan 6 years ago and you had a miscarriage when you were 19. Dr. Burks. Marnie? Marnie, stop. Marnie, your father died of cancer when you were 7 and your mother raised you alone since. She's currently in the hospital due to complications from smoking and you fear that you're to blame for not getting her into rehab and dash. Dr. Burks jumps from her chair at this point, knocking it over I presume. Dr. Burks, Marnie? Stop this. Oh. How do you know this? Marnie, it's in the room, with us. Dr. Burks presumably picks her chair up and sits back down. She laughs out loud to herself, most likely in disbelief at the situation. Dr. Burks, what is it, Marnie? Marnie, its name is Sweet Tooth. It loves to eat sweet things. Dr. Burks, where is it? Where in the room is it? Marnie? Dr. Burks, Marnie, where is it? Marnie, it's standing right next to you. At this point in the tape, everything goes quiet for a solid 5 seconds. Dr. Burks then all of a sudden gasps but doesn't move from her chair. The fear in her voice as she closed out the tape sent chills down my spine when I heard it. Dr. Burks? I can feel it breathing down my neck. The tape abruptly cuts after Burks' confession. Not long after this tape, Marnie was last seen running into the woods. Dr. Burks also became catatonic and was institutionalized, believing that her imaginary friend named Sweet Tooth wanted her to die so they could be friends forever. I joined in on the search parties that scoured the woods for Marnie Hughes, hoping to find her, and the only lead I had to the disappearances of Occoquan's children. Sweet Tooth. I had a group of other detectives working with me on this case, and the police force finally decided to look into this seriously for the first time in years since it's the only time any suspect was even so much as mentioned. The first few days of the search were mostly uneventful. The most notable thing was the search dogs continuously leading us up barren and empty trees and to the river. More members of the police force joined in on the searches as some other children disappeared into the woods during our case, and quite a number of civilians helped us out as well. A part of this case that really stuck out to me was when I mapped where each missing child was last seen. Not only did all of them go missing in the woods, including Hugo Barnes whose house was sequestered in the forest, they formed a perfect triangle around the Crane Mansion. But there was one notable early search. A few colleagues and I headed out in the woods by the Crane Mansion. It was pitch black, dense fog permeated every corner of the forest, and aside from us, there wasn't a sound filling the air. No crickets, no frogs, not a single coo from an owl. Silence, intermingled with the occasional search dog and the brushing of dead leaves on the forest floor. Our flashlights barely helped as they seemingly never actually breached the fog for more than 5 inches in front of us. About an hour into the woods, I was startled by an officer yelling, "Hey! I think I finally got something." The rush over to him was filled with a fear that can only be described as bricks crushing my lungs. Was it Marnie? Was it her corpse? Those questions filtered through my mind, leaving me with nothing but dread where my stomach should have been. All of that only to find a bundle of sticks, leaves and rocks. They were snapped and tied together in a strange formation that resembled some kind of rune. I'll insert a quick drawing of what I remember it looking like, as the original pictures we took are tucked away in evidence. Right by it though, there were 3 piles of rocks that seemed to form some triangular formation around the makeshift figure. We took pictures for evidence, but we didn't really find anything else that night. It seems so strange to me now how casual we were about finding the sticks and rocks, because from there on out they became a staple of every search. We were bound to find at least a handful of those sticks, all accompanied by rock piles forming a triangle around them. My next event of note was about 3 weeks after our first search. We trampled through the damp woods, this time during the evening. It was strange being out in those woods and actually being able to hear and see the wildlife. Crows called, moths parked on the bark of trees, and the occasional swan could be heard out on the nearby river. I remember having found a trail and following it with a few colleagues and a search dog. The trail was increasingly hard to follow and seemed to twist and turn through the forest at random. Eventually we stumbled upon a strange sight. Dolls, strewn throughout the trees. They were all clearly decaying, having been exposed to the forces of nature for who knows how long. We followed the rotting dolls until they led us into a nook in the path which took us up to a hidden area that was built within the Crane estate. What we found was unbelievably strange. Past the rusted gate of this area was a small gravesite. It didn't belong to the city, and it was never documented as having been owned or made by the Cranes. Stranger still, the headstones listed people yet to die. It was right around this discovery when a colleague noted something eerie. Silence. No more birds, no more insects, even the sounds of our feet on leaves seemed muffled. We took pictures and quickly left. We traveled back up the trail to meet with the other officers and detectives, but our search dog stopped in her tracks about halfway through. I remember her owner, Search and Rescue Officer Marks, tugging on her leash to get her to move, but no response. She stared out into the dense forest, alerted and entranced by something. We waited for her to ease up and come along, but her tail was firmly tucked between her legs and the hair on her back was puffed up like a porcupine. Something we couldn't see was spooking her. As Marks went to tug her away and up the path again, she let out the lowest and most bone-chilling growl I've ever heard come out of a dog. Not wanting to fuck around and find out, I started up the path again. I must have scared the dog because she startled and snapped out of whatever state she was in and followed us. The chills that ran throughout my body were enough to make me haul us back up that trail, and as I looked back at my colleagues, I glimpsed something out in the woods. It looked like a flowy, stained, white dress meandering behind a tree. Instinct kicked in, ignoring my previous fear, and I booked it into the woods without a second thought. I rushed toward the tree where I swore I just saw a girl, and nothing. My colleagues ran up behind me with the exception of the dog and Marks, the dog standing alert and terrified at the edge of the path. Before I could say anything, an officer bent down and picked something off of the ground. A picture that will be seared into my memory until the day I die. A pale corpse, clearly waterlogged and rotting away, in a white, flowy dress. Marnie. The following days were much the same as they had been, no new clues, no hints, only more disappearances. That was until the Jordan family case, which began to set a new precedent for things to come. The Jordans were a relatively average family who lived within the more urban parts of Occoquan. By all accounts they were normal. So, no one had any suspicion to believe that they'd murder and cannibalize their own children, then ritualistically kill themselves by hanging in their front yard tree, swinging side by side with the strewn corpses of their half-eaten children Micah and Candace Jordan. This case is of interest because of one singular thing found at the crime scene. Micah's diary, which detailed his parents meeting a neighbor named Sweet Tooth. This then became a trend, seemingly random couples in Occoquan dying in murder/suicides. And if they were unlucky enough to have children, cannibalization. It was a Friday when I had my own run-in with this Sweet Tooth. My house had been silent that evening as I went over details of the crime scenes. Each one followed the same pattern. The couple would meet a new neighbor named Sweet Tooth. He'd integrate himself into the family and become acquainted with them. In all the diaries, phone texts, saved calls, notes etc., the couple seemed to be convinced of the unimportance of physical life. Each family brainwashed by this Sweet Tooth, convinced to give up their mortal forms and freeing their souls to some god in the afterlife. It must have been about an hour as the sun began to set, the night washing over the woods around my house in a pitch, murky blackness. I finished combing over the diaries and notes and drawings and photos which really began to stick with me. This field of work truly does take its toll on you, especially after having to dive headfirst into cases like this. It just becomes overwhelming and emotionally exhausting. I needed to call my mother. Reading about these kinds of incidents really fucked with me. Something came over me, the urge to tell her how much I loved her. I was on the call for all of 5 minutes when something caught my eye out in my backyard, a white, flowy dress. I apologized to my mother for leaving the call so quick and hung up. Bursting out of my house with my magnum and flashlight, I wandered around my yard. Silence, pure and utter silence. Meandering in the darkness of my yard, I could feel the blood drain from my face. A giggle echoed through the eerily silent woods and I scanned the imposing tree line. Nothing looked out of place, but that feeling of dread struck me deep in the chest until I felt like I simply just couldn't breathe anymore. I scanned through the tree line thoroughly, increasingly frustrated by whatever taunted me. A solid 30 seconds must have passed before I decided to give up my pathetic and terrified search and head back to my house. But something horrid stopped me in my tracks. Lurking there, at the window by my desk, was a young boy, maybe 12, with a brunette bowl cut and a garishly colored turtleneck. Hugo Barnes. I approached the window as he glided out of sight, and in the dark hallway, a tall figure left my room and headed out my front door. I busted inside and did a full military squad inspection of my house. Not a soul in sight. I looked at my desk where Hugo was, and it took a solid minute for me to realize what I was seeing. My papers drawn across my desk with the names of the murder/suicide families written across my map. A triangular shape with the Crane Mansion waiting in the middle of the formation. Something lingered in the air. It was no longer my home but an unwelcoming conjuring of fear. An urge itched within my mind. I needed to investigate the remnants of the Crane Mansion. I went into my room to grab my coat, and that's when I noticed the tape sitting in the middle of my bed. I picked it up and let curiosity indulge itself, sliding it into the player. Dr. Burks, Marnie? Marnie, it's speaking to you? Dr. Burks audibly jumped up from her chair, sending it crashing as Marnie yelped. Dr. Burks, Marnie? What is it? What is it? Tell it to leave me alone. I can feel it breathing on me. Make it stop. Dr. Burks was clearly in hysterics. She was screaming and crying, backing away from her tape recorder. Dr. Burks, make it leave me alone, Marnie. What the hell is it saying? Marnie, it's saying? Sweet tooth, you're so sweet, Samara. The mention of my name felt like a fist pummeling my gut. I got in my car and I don't think I've speeded so fast in my life. Red lights didn't matter to me. I needed to get down to the station and find this heathen. Me and quite a few officers made haste toward the Crane Mansion. The drive down the twisted roads felt like an unforgiving eternity, marked by posters taunting me. Pulling onto the decrepit street, here it stood, its jagged and vicious architecture peering down on all of Occoquan. The windows hauntingly appeared like malicious eyes enveloped in the blackness of the night. The mansion wasn't locked, and its massive doors creaked open like the moaning souls of the damned. Walking in, the air felt so thick you could cut it, and the floorboards creaked as if in pain with every step. The house reeked with the stench of copper, rotting fish, and the odor of trash left out to sit in the hot sun for days. No one seemed to have moved in after the Cranes. All of their items and furniture sat in the house, rotting away like the forgotten relics they were. Me and 2 of the 4 officers headed down into the basement after clearing the first floor. The other 2 officers made their way upstairs. But it wasn't long until me and my colleagues came across the waterlogged, decomposing corpse of Marnie Hughes in the basement. We tried contacting the 2 who went upstairs, but our walkies hissed with a vicious static. One of my 2 officers went up to find them as me and the other officer searched the remaining basement. We found a cellar that was boarded up by the Cranes after they built the house. Despite the evident corpse, the cellar was where the stench seemed to really be emanating from. It was almost like burnt hair permeating every inch of my nostrils. My futile attempts to open the cellar ceased quickly as I found myself the only one working on it. My eyes fixed on the other officer, a short man called Perez. Even within the overpowering darkness, I could see that his eyes were wide, and his gun drawn, both in the direction of the corner of the basement. I caught on and glanced over. Standing in and facing the corner, enveloped by but significantly darker than the darkness itself, stood an almost indescribable figure. It must have been at least 7.5 feet in height, as its head was cocked to the side, too tall for the basement. The sound of dripping water now flooded my ears as my eyes adjusted to the amorphous thing standing before us. It shivered in the corner as a noise emanated from it. Breathing, I guess, is how I would describe the rustic sound it made. Yet as soon as I lifted my flashlight, nothing, what was once there now ceased to exist. Just then a commotion was heard upstairs. Perez and I ran past where the corpse of Marnie Hughes should have been lying but wasn't anymore and trudged up the basement steps in a panic. The other 3 officers practically came tumbling down the second story. What we heard of their testaments I still don't want to believe. The older female officer, Matthews, opened a closet door in one of the children's rooms. And following a stench coming from the crawlspace in the lower corner of the closet, she opened it. The Crane mansion has since been gutted from the inside out, after Matthews uncovered the darkest secret of Occoquan. Inside the walls, floors, roofs, ceilings, and yards of that evil house, the bones and rotting remains of hundreds of missing children laid. The Crane household was demolished not long after, and the remains of those poor souls were put to rest at once. The only thing remaining of the mansion is the cellar. I don't know whether they couldn't open it or merely didn't want to see what horrors it held, but it lays there, haunting the forest where the Crane mansion once stood. That brings me to today. I moved away from Occoquan in the year 2000. The knowledge that something incredibly dangerous was out there and I was directly putting myself in its way was overbearing. But the area's mysteries have always been in the back of mind. What was inside the cellar that the Cranes felt the need to board up so tightly? What was Sweet Tooth? And what did it want with the children and families of Occoquan? But I still fear that whatever Sweet Tooth was, it's still out there. The corpse of Marnie Hughes still remains unfound. There's been an influx of missing children's cases not only where I'm currently situated, but throughout all of the mid-Atlantic USA. Be careful. Unseen. My family has always been big on Halloween. Our homes are decorated with cobwebs, plastic skeletons, and carved pumpkins. We walked the streets when we were kids, dressed in various costumes, and now, as adults, we host costume parties filled with laughter and nostalgia. Every year we reminisce about the past, sharing fond memories of mischief and misadventures. But there's one particular story that stands out, one that still sends shivers down our spines and elicits a mix of laughter and chills when recounted during our family Halloween group messages. This story isn't just a reflection of our childhood, it's a chilling experience that has forever embedded itself in our collective memories. October 31st, 1991. I had just turned 2 in June and was already sleeping in my own bedroom, which had once been a designated nursery. We lived in a suburb of Houston, Texas, an area that was once densely forested but has since transformed into a row of neatly lined houses. I remember that Halloween night vividly, as if it were etched into my memory. There was a large window in my room, framing the view of the backyard and the woods beyond, where shadows danced in the moonlight. On this particular Halloween, the moon was in a waning crescent shape, casting just enough light to see by but leaving the edges of the woods shrouded in darkness. I had a big plastic cutout jack-o'-lantern hanging by a thumbtack on my wall. Its grinning face reflected the splintered moonlight, creating an eerie setting, a perfect backdrop for the events that would unfold. My mom, 2 older brothers, and I were all worn out after a lengthy candy excursion that went well past our usual bedtime. My 2 siblings had their own rooms, and my parents were in the living room, engrossed in the horror classic Night of the Living Dead. I laid beneath my covers, listening to the sound of the swirling ceiling fan overhead, my drifting eyes wandering toward the window, half asleep and half caught in the excitement of the night. And then it came, the sound that would haunt my dreams for years to come. A faint scratching like the delicate pawing of a kitten at a glass door. Only we didn't have a kitten, and there certainly wasn't a glass door in my room. I stirred fully awake, straining to identify the source of the sound. The house was silent, save for the rhythmic whir of the ceiling fan and the muffled screams from the television. Barbara, in her frantic bid for survival, chased through the abandoned streets, pursued by a horde of the undead. The scratching came again, now more pronounced, like fingernails raking at the base of my window. I looked towards the window, the moonlight spilling across the room, illuminating the space but leaving the corners cloaked in shadow. Nothing was there. The branches of trees swayed gently outside, their silhouettes casting ghostly shapes on the walls. I listened intently, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination playing tricks. But then the scratching returned, a persistent, insistent sound, now louder and seemingly more urgent. It sent a cold shiver down my spine. What could it be? A ghost? A murderer? My brothers had warned me about the boogeyman, the creature that lurked in the dark corners of our imagination. Was it some other creature from the depths of the forest, using Halloween as cover to creep into my room? Scratching, scratching, scratching. It felt like invisible fingers were attempting to break in, to eat me, or drag me away to realms unknown. The very thought terrified me. Finally, unable to contain my fear any longer, I screamed, a wail that echoed through the house, a cry of pure terror that only a 2.5-year-old could muster. My mom came charging into my room, bursting through the door like a firefighter responding to an emergency. "What's wrong?" "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "There's something at my window." I cried, pointing frantically at the source of my fear. It's trying to get in? She paused, listening intently, and to my horror she heard the scratching sound too. Alarmed, she flipped on the light and rushed to the window. Her heart must have raced like mine as she looked outside, scanning the darkness for any signs of danger. Nothing. No ghost, no murderer, no boogeyman. Not even a lizard or moth fluttering by. Just the trees swaying gently in the night breeze, yet the scratching persisted, as if mocking our efforts to find its source. My mom called for my dad, and soon my brothers rushed into the room, armed with pop guns, their expressions a mix of concern and confusion. My dad stepped inside, hearing the scratching sound as well, his brow furrowing in concentration. "Where is it?" he asked, moving to the window beside my mom, who was still peering out into the night. "I don't know," I whimpered, trembling in my blankets. "It's right there. It's trying to get in." But again nothing was found. Just the shadows playing tricks on our eyes. My dad turned back to me, his face reflecting the same confusion. Yet the scratching came again, relentless and unnerving. Then, in that moment of frantic searching, we finally discovered the culprit. Scraping the wall just above my bed, just above my head, was the plastic cutout of the grinning jack-o'-lantern. The thumbtack that had secured it had loosened, causing it to sway and scrape against the wall whenever the ceiling fan stirred the air. My dad took it down, and as soon as he did, the scratching sound ceased. The tension in the room melted away, replaced by relieved laughter, though I still felt a shiver of fear clinging to me. What a fright it had been, and I could hear my brothers chuckling in the background, already teasing me about my childish fears. In the weeks and months that followed, the story of the Halloween night with the unseen scratching became a staple in our family lore. Each Halloween, as we decorated the house with ghosts and ghouls, my brothers would inevitably bring it up, laughing about how I had nearly lost my mind over a plastic jack-o'-lantern. Despite their teasing, I knew that Halloween would forever hold a special place in my heart. The magic of that night remained intact, woven together with the bonds of family and the memories we shared. Years later, on the night of October 31st, we gathered as adults in my parents' living room, reminiscing about our childhood traditions and Halloween escapades. We shared stories of costumes, trick-or-treating, and the haunted houses we dared each other to explore. And every year, without fail, the story of the unseen scratching would emerge, accompanied by laughter and a touch of nostalgia. It had become a rite of passage, a reminder of the innocence of childhood fears and the comfort of family. As we settled into the evening, I glanced out the window, half expecting to see the familiar outline of the trees swaying gently in the moonlight. Instead, I was greeted with the sight of our own children, dressed in costumes, running about the yard, their laughter echoing through the night. This Halloween, I vowed to share my story with them, to pass down the legacy of the unseen scratching. And perhaps one day they would share it too, ensuring that the memories lived on for generations to come. Because no matter how old we got, we would always be a family that embraced the magic of Halloween, a family that faced its fears together. And as the moonlight bathed our home in its soft glow, I knew that Halloween would always be more than just a holiday. It would be a time to celebrate our shared experiences, to embrace the unseen, and to cherish the love that bound us together. A dream on Halloween. It was warm. It was cold. Wisps of thin dark mists drifted in a lazy breath of breeze, swirling around like spectral dancers. Shadowy trees waved their changing leaves in the crisp autumn moonlight, their branches casting intricate shadows on the ground. A thin dark dress clung tightly to her body, the fabric accentuating her curves in all the right places. Her golden hair rustled around her smooth face, catching glimmers of moonlight. Bright blue eyes sparkled with an ethereal light, reflecting the tranquil stillness of the night. Her feet were bare, and her legs drifted magnificently below the hem of her dress, each step a soft caress against the cool earth. She felt powerful yet vulnerable, as if the night had wrapped her in its embrace. She had never clothed herself so revealingly, so seductively, so enticingly. Would Travis approve? He might claim she was luring every eye to her beautiful, wonderful body, but tonight she didn't care. Up ahead, she saw a shadow materializing in the moonlight, concealed by the thin wisps of the dark mists. It took shape under the pale beams, revealing a broad-shouldered figure. A handsome figure, a tempting figure, an alluring dream who rose to his full height as she was inexplicably drawn closer. Eyes that shimmered like emeralds met hers. A voice that was hollow yet deep resonated through the night air. The figure wore a white linen shirt reminiscent of the dashing heroes she read about in her fantasy novels, a striking contrast to the darkness that surrounded them. She longed to run her hands over his firm form. "I put a spell on you," the figure sang lowly, the words swirling around them like a gentle breeze, because you're mine. His voice was enrapturing, pulling her into a dreamlike state. His eyes dazzled with a mixture of mischief and desire, a mystery that left her both captivated and breathless. "Watch out," he said suddenly, lunging toward her with playful intensity. "I ain't lying ya." The warm touch of his fingertips brushed against her chin, igniting a fire in her heart she had never felt before. Thunderous beats echoed within her as he moved to her side, slipping into her peripheral vision while her gaze remained locked ahead. "I can't stand no running around," he sang, his breath warm against her ear. "I can't stand no putting me down. I put a spell on you." His lips pressed gently against the soft flesh of her neck, sending shivers cascading through her body. "Because you're mine." Every nerve tingled, electrified by his presence. A heaviness stirred deep within her, a sensation she had never experienced before, urging her to embrace the moment. She closed her eyes, feeling his body press against her spine, and suddenly she was aware of how different this night was from her reality with Travis. "Stop the things you do," he whispered after kissing her neck again. "Watch out." Then, as if the world around her shifted, she opened her eyes, and her heart dropped into her stomach. Travis stood before her, pale and lifeless. His body slumped, the familiar warmth now replaced by an eerie stillness. Crimson warmth flowed onto her hand, where she held a kitchen knife just below his ribs, its blade slick and shining in the moonlight. "I ain't lying," sang the figure as he dashed in front of her, obscuring her husband's body. He transformed Travis into a drifting haze of dust, a wisp of memory that evaporated into the cool night air. "I love you." Her eyes ignited as they locked onto his green gaze, a fire consuming her thoughts and inhibitions. She could feel his hardened desire pressing against her, drawing her lips to meet his. "I don't care if you don't want me, I'm yours right now," he sang after their kiss, his voice laced with longing and intensity. He slid his hand around her waist, pulling her closer as he began to unzip her dress, his fingers brushing against her skin. "I put a spell on you," he continued, sliding one strap of her dress down her arm, his eyes gleaming with mischief, "because you're mine." The world around her spun into a fast-moving haze. The air crackled with energy and she felt alive, more alive than she had ever felt before. Just as the final strap fell, a blinding flash of light enveloped her, and she felt herself falling. She woke up with a gasp, popping her head up and looking around her darkened bedroom. The soft glow of the television illuminated the room, casting flickering shadows against the walls. A fuzzy music video played on the screen showcasing some eccentric performer, Screamin' Jay Hawkins, with his wild theatrics and hypnotic presence. Breathing heavily, she realized that she had been dreaming. Her heart raced as she turned to find Travis sleeping peacefully beside her, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. She felt an unsettling mix of relief and confusion. "You okay, babe?" he murmured, stirring slightly at her movement. It took her a second to reply, her mind still reeling from the vividness of the dream. "Yeah, I'm fine, babe. Just a weird dream, I guess. Want me to go get you some water?" he asked, concern etching his features as he blinked sleepily. "No, I'm good. Just going to get back to sleep." She turned back to the television, the vibrant colors and sounds still swirling in her mind, trying to shake off the remnants of the dream. Travis glanced at the blue lights of the clock on the dresser, the soft glow shining dimly on a small figure of a skeleton with a tie, glasses, and a pink mohawk staring back at him with a nostalgic smile. "Hey, it's after midnight," he said, a playful smile creeping onto his face. "Happy Halloween, babe." She felt a dampness in an area that likely wasn't from sweat as she laid back under the covers, trying to reconcile the sensations that still lingered from her dream. "Yeah, happy Halloween," she echoed, her voice distant. Sleep eluded her as the dream replayed in her mind, the allure of the mysterious figure and the intoxicating thrill of his touch. She could still feel the weight of his gaze and the magnetic pull of his presence. It left her breathless, yet she found herself feeling guilty. Was it wrong to be entranced by someone else even in a dream? The thought stirred an unsettling mix of emotions. As the night wore on, she tossed and turned, the shadows of her dream blending into reality. Travis snored softly beside her, a comforting reminder of the life they had built together. But as her mind wandered, she found herself thinking about the figure from her dream, the spell he had cast, the power he seemed to hold over her. The air in the room felt charged, electric, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing just beyond the veil of the ordinary. She glanced toward the window where the moon hung low in the sky, casting its silver light across the landscape. It seemed to call to her, beckoning her to step into the unknown. Compelled by an inexplicable urge, she slid out of bed, careful not to disturb Travis. The cool floor met her bare feet as she moved toward the window, her heart pounding with anticipation. The world outside was cloaked in shadows, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. She pulled back the curtain, revealing the glimmering night. And then she saw him. Standing beneath the gnarled branches of an ancient oak tree, the figure from her dream waited. His green eyes shimmered like emeralds in the darkness, and that same enigmatic smile played on his lips. Her breath caught in her throat, a mix of fear and exhilaration coursing through her veins. He raised a hand, gesturing for her to join him, and she felt her heart race. It was absurd. She was still in her pajamas in her own house, but she was drawn to him as if an invisible thread connected them. The night air whispered promises of adventure and temptation, and for a fleeting moment she considered stepping out into the darkness. But then she hesitated, memories of her life with Travis flooding back. The love they had nurtured, the dreams they had shared. She could not forsake that for a dream, no matter how intoxicating it was. Her heart ached at the thought of betrayal, even if it was just a dream. "Come on," the figure's voice resonated through the night, smooth and inviting. "Don't be afraid. I won't bite, unless you want me to." The playful lilt of his tone made her pulse quicken, and she felt the pull of his allure once more. Yet, she stood frozen at the window, torn between desire and loyalty. "Who are you?" she called out, her voice a whisper against the night. "A friend," he replied, a teasing smile dancing on his lips. "I'm here to show you what you've been missing. What you truly desire." Her mind raced. Did she truly desire him? The thrill of the dream lingered, but could it compare to the life she had built? As she wrestled with her thoughts, the figure stepped closer, the shadows shifting around him, revealing a deeper allure. He looked like a fantasy come to life, a dream manifesting in flesh and bone. "Your husband sleeps, oblivious to your longing," he said softly, his voice dripping with seduction. "Why not embrace what you want? Step into the night and discover who you are."